feel at home here in a funny way. Don't ask me why, it's probably very ghoulish, but there's something very graceful about these old stones. Hello, I'm Anthony Brandt. I'm here with Zach Studentroth and with Kurt Kahofer. They are, what shall I say, the Burying Ground Preservation Group. And here we are in a burying ground right next to the Whalers Church in Sag Harbor, which is behind me, looking at one of the oldest and in many ways the most destitute of burying grounds. There are stones turned over, stones that are broken, stones that you can't read anything on because the lichen has covered it. And these gentlemen tell me that they can repair this. And I believe them because I've seen some of their work.
Yes. When you begin to read the epitaphs, it brings you kind of closer to these people. These were all real lives lived. Every stone has a story. I feel a connection to some of these people. It develops. It's important to remember that all of these stones are carved records of people's lives. And in many cases, they may be the only record of the individual who's been interred. In fact, we would like to think they're probably the most accurate record. After all, once a stone has been carved, you would imagine that they had the right information. Records don't always agree. So just from a genealogical standpoint, this is a treasure trove of data, information about these people. Tidbits of lives emerge from the stones that you might not otherwise know. There's nothing quite like working on an actual stone, which perhaps has broken or it's become soiled, and you're coming into contact with that, and you feel as if in some way you're resurrecting the not the life of the person, but the life of the stone, and perpetuating its message. So it's a good feeling.
You know these stones intimately, and we're looking at sandstone, marble, all kinds of stones here. But I noticed that the brown sandstones seem to take the most wear. Can the inscriptions be recovered?
They can, not as easily as a marble headstone, because of two reasons. One, the age of the brown stone, which predate the use of marble, so they're automatically the earliest ones. Therefore, they've been out in the weather much longer. They're also more porous and susceptible to freezing, rain, thawing, cracking, which often just knocks the entire face of the stone off. And hence the reason if there's so much lichen on them is because the water just sits in that brownstone, sandstone, and grows all kinds of microbial creatures. It all can be removed. And once done and cleaned, there is a very good chance that the inscriptions can be read again, unless the entire face has flaked off, which is the case in lots of these stones because they haven't been cared for so long. So there's hope.
There is help.
Yes.
There's hope.
There's hope and help.
Hope and help.
Sure.
Closely.
I think over behind us there are several large stones that are lying on the ground. There are 3 in a row. For one, it's important to point out that Long Island's first resident stone carver, a fellow named Ithiel Hill, arrived here in the 1790s from Connecticut. He was one of a larger group of family stone carvers, and he saw a business opportunity to come here, affluent village of people who were traveled and accustomed, and they might be might be willing to purchase his product. So we're looking at 3 hill stones here. They're quite colossal. These are marble. This one to the left is the thickest of the 3, but each has suffered from what very large marble tablets often do, which is that tilting a little bit, they eventually fell and broke. If we look carefully at one of them, we can see that it has been repaired before, but the repair didn't last, and so it has fallen and broken again. So one of the objectives at this site is to basically reclaim as much of Ithiel Hill's work as we can. This is the greatest concentration of his work on Long Island. We will see 1 or 2 examples in other places. But it's logical that these families that were prospering from the whaling trades and other enterprises had the means to employ Mr. Hill to carve them their headstones. These are from the early 1800s and have the very characteristic willow tree, the weeping willow, as an emblem at the top, very, very popular in that period. And that emblem in that period basically takes the place of what was more typical in the earlier period, which were cherubs with wings that were kind of, or soul effigies that kind of took your mind to the process of death and the hereafter. What's important from a kind of, not from a religious standpoint, but in the use of the weeping willow, it expresses sorrow, but it's not the same kind of loss that the earlier stones, sometimes with skulls and crossbones, much more severe. This is kind of a more gentle metaphor for death, which is typical of that period. So these are very beautiful stones, and as bad as they look, and of course they're prone to being run over by the lawnmower if someone is not paying attention, which just increases their vulnerability, but these are very repairable. They're virtually intact, they can be reattached and brought back to life. So these are important here.
Is it an expensive process?
Not necessarily. Sometimes it's surprising. Something can look horrendous. All these bases need to be straightened first so that when these pieces are reattached, they're not inclined toward falling off again. But these are fairly simple repairs. Ideally, these would be pinned in addition to using some sort of a structural adhesive, which gives something of this weight greater strength. What conservators are tending to use these days are nylon or plastic rods as opposed to steel or metal, because if someone were to lean on it, the tendency is the stone gives
has some
at the
bounce.
same break
Yes.
line,
Yeah.
so you don't suffer more loss of the stone. So over the years, and we like to say when we see early repairs, that's not a problem. I mean, any early repair is a good intention. And even to put this back up for a period of 10 or 20 years was better than, and people, they use what comes to hand or what is considered to be the best product of the period. So it's never right to look back on old repairs as bad repairs, they just failed. And now it's our duty to renew them.
And to the point of the cost, it's important to consider that the cost is relatively low compared to what most people just assume it might be, because to a lot of people this is almost something that is impossible or daunting. But since we know how to do this, it's not.
Right.
That's one aspect of the cost. The other aspect of the cost is that when we do repair and realign and set straight, we're doing that for the period of many, many, many decades following. So although it's a one-time cost, let's say for these 3 stones, the cost is prorated over 50, 60, 70 years from now, which makes the cost over time for the preservation very low.
Can you do anything with that?
Yes.
Well, this is a footstone,
I'm taking it out.
and
It's a broken part of a footstone.
it's the broken top of a footstone, which was probably leaned up against this tree, which has
That's right.
also met its maker.
Right.
And
Now,
so,
it has 2 interesting aspects to it. There are initials in here which are yet to be deciphered. I can just feel them with my fingers. Upon cleaning, these can be matched to perhaps a headstone here, or since I just pulled it out of the ground so easily, could belong to somebody else.
Yeah.
right.
The other interesting thing is it does have a tag here that has number 42 on it.
Okay.
I don't really know what that means right now, but we could figure
Well,
that out.
I think it's important for us to give credit to a committee that was formed in the 1990s specifically for the purpose of surveying and recording this site, and also doing a few interventions, a few repairs, but that was not their primary purpose. And so they researched, there are some 330 some odd stones here. They did a lot of research, generated a book. It was the Old Burying Ground Committee. They were responsible for getting the town of Southampton, which had owned the site, to convey it to the village, because their belief at the time was that they would have a better chance of managing this site being local, and so that was their intention. As I said, they did some repairs. They brought out a book. There's a very good map. It's large map that's framed at the foot of the site where you enter, and you can see where everyone is. And they were the ones that discovered or recorded that, in fact, there are more than 20 patriots of the Revolutionary War that are interred here. That's an extraordinary number, and very important. Of course, there are organizations like the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution, other organizations who are very dedicated and focused to the patriots of that war. So this is a very remarkable concentration of monuments to those individuals. These were the two young men who were witnessing the celebration of the closing of the War of 1812, and they both met with an accidental death in the process of that celebration. So they were best friends, and they were buried together. And what's equally remarkable about this is that their footstone, which is usually about 5 to 6 feet back, that seems to have drifted down the hill a little bit, as sometimes happens, that the little footstone echoes the shape of their headstone. It's quite unusual.
And our local high school is named Pearson High School.
Pearson,
correct.
Yeah, one of these young men was a Pearson. This is a marble. This, when it was newly carved, would have been bright white. So what we're looking at is an encrusted lichens and mold and basically biogrowth. You know, we can think they look dirty, but it's not soil. It's living organisms that find their way into all the little porous crevices and thrive. But that's a very remarkable stone.
And upon cleaning with the right treatment, the inscription will be legible. We worked at a cemetery in Quogue where 30 headstones were illegible, and after cleaning, 30 were legible.
Yeah.
Wow.
So 30 records came back to life.
Excellent.
This would be one of those.
Yeah.
So a burying ground is associated with the colonial era in which the bodies are aligned in a west-east direction. And the purpose for that is that the interred will have the opportunity, the deceased, to sit up and witness the second coming of Christ rising from the east. And so it's a very, these sites, it doesn't matter where the streets are, the houses, the churches, none of that matters, east to west, universally.
Facing the wrong direction.
It's not until the 19th century when the adherence to that belief begins to soften and footstones disappear, and you see the word cemetery come into the vocabulary, and that derives from the Greek signifying a sleeping chamber. So now the attitude toward death has changed. It's a kind of a gentler vision. We've gone to our eternal rest in the cemetery, which is different from dying and being buried in a burying ground in the colonial period. And this east to west orientation changes as well. So that's what defines a burying ground of that early period. And so you will always see this east to west alignment. Sag Harbor was actually settled in the early 18th century, 1707 or so is when it's first documented in the town records. But it's not until much later in the century that there was a need to establish a burying ground here, because the earliest inhabitants of the town basically commuted here because it was a port, but they didn't live here continuously. There were no churches, no other amenities. So it's not until the middle of the 18th century that a sufficient number of people have settled here to require their own burying ground. So it's in as late as about 1760 or so that this site is set aside. Typical of this procedure in that period on Long Island, it was the town fathers, the people who were managing the town's affairs who set this aside. It was a municipal burying ground, which it has remained to this very day. So there are some interments that predate the Revolutionary War, but it happens to correspond with that conflict. and therefore there is a wonderful concentration of people who had served, who died in the conflict, about 21 or so, I believe. And then it continued to, it began to fill up. This is not a large site, so by the 1840s, there was very little land left. That doesn't mean that every little spot was occupied, but it meant that the local families who spoke for a certain area had plans for that. So in that sense, the burying ground was pretty much set aside and assigned. And so that's when Oakland was opened across town in the 1840s. And that actually took some of the burials from here over there to continue the family practices there. So the real history of this stretches from about 1760 to about 1840.
We've left the old burying ground and we're here in Oakland Cemetery, which is about a quarter of a mile distance from the old burying ground. This was founded in 1805, but it didn't really get busy until the time of the whaling boom in Sag Harbor. This really is a much more elaborate cemetery. A lot of obelisks. We'll come soon to the broken mast, which that's whaling money. That's what did it, and that's what made this possible. But since then, it's become very popular. We're about to pass the grave of George Balanchine right down here, and he's as famous a dancer as you'll ever find. And right around the corner is Danilova, one of his principal dancers. Obviously, this is a real pilgrimage site for a lot of people that I know who care about ballet way more than I do, as it happens.
Sure. So here, when Tony was talking about pilgrimage, which happens often in cemeteries and burial grounds where people are buried who have some kind of notoriety of any kind, even not famous notoriety. This person, however, George Balanchine, you can see people come, put nutcracker effigies in front of his stone, shells, rocks, trinkets. They care about him. And there he is. He thought that somehow the Sag Harbor environs, he thought looked like part of France that he was enamored with for his whole life. And that's why he decided to be buried here. That's one account that I read, that it reminded him of his favorite region of France.
So we're standing in front of what's popularly known as the Broken Mast Monument. We're surrounded by other obelisks, very tall, tapering marble shafts, which are based on an Egyptian precedent, and one theory being that these are like needles that are pointing up toward heaven. But there's an association to ancient Egypt and the obelisk form. What is quite remarkable and very moving about the Broken Mast Monument is that it's a metaphor for being lost at sea. And so what replaces, and it's a monument, Howell family members and related people, this is a monument that was erected in memory of ship's captains that were lost at sea. And so the front of it, it's four-sided on this colossal base. The front of it has a very deep relief carving showing a whaleboat with the whale ship, the actual ship in the distance, but the whale boat in the foreground, in which sailors are basically abandoned at sea, and there's a whale that's tipping them over. So it's a kind of an action image showing the plight of the sailors out at sea. And then on the other three sides of the base are various sailors and ship's captains who were actually lost at sea. But the powerful image is the obelisk itself, which is not typical like a tapering shaft that terminates in a point. It rather appears to be a broken mast from a ship, and the top is broken off. The ropes are coiled around at the bottom. So it's a very powerful image of these individuals having been lost in their battle with the Leviathan, the whale, out in the middle of the ocean. Erected in the 1850s, really at the height of the whaling era. And so there were many individuals whose lives had been lost. What's so interesting when you read the details, it's often assumed that a ship's captain was probably an older fellow who had spent many, many years at sea. The reality is
They're all
that
young.
they're all young.
They're all in their
all
20s
young.
and 30s.
They were all in their 20s. Because if you took to the sea, as they would say, you know, by your third or fourth voyage, each of which could have lasted as many as 3 years, you were promoted, and very often these ships' captains were quite young. So it's a very powerful monument.
When they were actually in the presence of whales and hunting them, they everybody except a skeleton crew went in the whale boats and hunted the whales, and many of them lost their lives because the whales don't want to be hunted. Isn't that funny?
Yeah. They just had that aversion to being
Yes.
pierced with spears.
Well, they were known as the cows of the sea because they were friendly, and they didn't swim away from the harpoon whale boats that got disembarked from the main ship. They were curious, so they came close. Just like cows in a pasture come over, they don't run. And so they were an easy target, especially certain types of whales were more friendlier than others. So it was a difficult job, very dangerous, but the whales, known as the cows of the sea, mammals as they are, would come close and be curious. I used to bring my elementary school classes here. We used to sit on that curb, have snack, and talk about the whaling history of Sag Harbor in front of this monument, and it meant a lot to the kids. It's their town, it's their village.
Yeah.
And so this is a great educational spot for the history of Sag Harbor also, not just this monument, but others. This one especially, though.
Right. These stones are Captain David Hand, who fought in the Revolution as a privateer, which is a kind of thief of the sea. A privateer has a license to go out and steal and take the shipping of the enemy, which in this case would be the British. He sailed out of Sag Harbor. He had 5 wives, and here they all lie. I found this a lot of fun. It's sad to see all these stones and what they mean, and so many of them broken. And that's what happens to the past. The past gets broken. People forget it. But this is a kind of living place of memory. You can come here, you can read these stones, you can find out a great deal about local history, and about the history of mankind at the same time. I mean, how many people have 5 wives and outlive all but one? That's pretty fun. And the Broken Mast Monument is just a kind of an old beauty. And all those people dying at sea in the presence of whales. And they're so young. So that's our show. Hope you enjoyed it.